welcome back to Stand By for Adventure. This is John. It is Thaco Thursday, as you can see, but I'm actually on the last slide of the PowerPoint that I have put together here. So today what we're going to talk about is unintended consequences in role-playing games. I'm going to start with a little bit of intended consequences so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But this does actually have significant effects on how you run and play games, depending on the rules that you're playing, depending on the game that you're playing, depending on the style of game that you're playing, and how the design decisions made by game designers has an impact, even though you may not really think of it as having an impact. And we can see also how our expectations for role-playing games have changed over time during the course of this, I hope, fairly brief discussion. So let's get into this and talk about it a little bit. And first thing I want to say, however, is I ordered something off of DriveThruRPG, and man, I am continually impressed by their POD service. I've wanted this adventure, The Red Hand of Doom for 3rd edition, for a long time, and it's a sizable book. It's 136 pages, something like that, and ordered it print on demand from DriveThru. I'm not sponsored by DriveThru. Man, I would love to be though, because I love their stuff. I just think they do great work. And the printing is gorgeous, and it looks exactly like the old 3rd edition product. I know the format is slightly different for this, because I think that this original product came with a bunch of maps in it. But I've always been really curious about this adventure, because it's like a big invasion storyline starting the characters at 6th level. And I may actually attempt to adapt this for a game sometime in the somewhat near future. I don't think it really works with any of the games I'm running right now, but it should be really fun, and I'm looking forward to it. And I mention this simply because, man, I am impressed with their print-on-demand stuff. If you haven't been picking up anything POD from DriveThru Roleplaying or DriveThruRPG because you weren't sure about the quality, believe me, the quality is there. The books are just fantastic. I also wanted to remind people that Monsters of the Multiverse is coming out in the next week or two. I think next week I'm actually going to do a little bit of a review of this book again, so if you are on the fence about whether or not you want to pick it up, we'll just go through it a little bit, take a look at some of the monsters, see if you like what is in there, and if you do, hopefully that will help give you a more informed decision on if you want to buy the book or not. I bought it even in that stupid, ridiculous, expensive 3-book set simply because I found it for a good price, and I really wanted to update the monsters in the monster book I was writing with the rules that they have in this multiverse book. But let's move on to unintended consequences in role-playing games. First thing I wanted to talk about is intended consequences. These are things like, and again, I will frequently, almost always use Dungeons & Dragons as the example, but this also applies for Pathfinder, it applies for any edition of D&D, it applies for any edition of Pathfinder, it applies for any edition of Dungeon Crawl Classics. I think there is only one edition of that. And it applies to really any other game where you have classes that are pre-built, or you have combinations of abilities that you put together to build a class that does a certain thing. And in this case, what I mean is rogues are good at moving around the battlefield fairly unencumbered and being able to deal significant amounts of damage, but that damage is reliant on having other people around them or attacking from surprise. So that reinforces the whole idea of the rogue, right? That is the intended consequence of the way backstab works for rogue. You need to either hide and strike from surprise in order to be the most effective and deal the most damage, or you need to be fighting alongside someone, and the idea is you are opportunistically taking shots at someone when they expose a weakness well, fighting with someone else or being threatened by someone else. So if your companion, hey, hello kitten, if your companion is, come on down, get out of the way. If your companion is a fighter and is, going to town on one of the bad guys, and you sneak up next to them and stab at them, it's going to be more effective. Another intended consequence: fighters are good at controlling the battlefield in some instances, are able to take a hit because they have good armor class. They know how to use pretty much any weapon. They're physically tough, typically, or fast, and generally resilient. Same thing for barbarians. Barbarians are meant to be the tanks. They are the ones who are in the middle of combat. They're able to take a bunch of hits. And that informs how you play those characters. A barbarian almost never will be sitting at range shooting a bow like a ranger or a rogue. They won't be staying at range casting spells like a cleric or wizard. That's just not what they do. That's not what they're built to do. So the consequences of the way the character class is designed is the barbarian is up in the middle of combat. That's where they want to be. That's what they want to be doing. Wizards obviously typically are going to be at range. Sometimes they're also combined with fighters, in which case you're going to have the consequences of making that decision as a character, of creating that character, of deciding if you are going to have a wizard who concentrates on ranged spells or close combat spells so that you can boost yourself when you're in hand-to-hand combat with somebody else, something like the Blade Singer, that sort of thing. But you can also make decisions for your spells. Maybe you want to control the battlefield. Maybe you want to control other people. Maybe you want to do a bunch of, who knows? I mean, it could be almost anything, but the spells allow you to change the way the wizard plays, and you may have a certain way that you want to play, and you specifically take those spells in order to play that type of character. So that's what I mean by intended consequences. The sorts of things that make the game behave the way the designers wanted and make it perform in the way that the players expect, given whatever it is they're doing or the class they're playing or what they're trying to attempt to do. So that's intended. Now, when we move on to unintended consequences, we get into some really interesting territory, and we can see how things have sort of changed over time, and people, both gamers and DMs, have changed their assumptions about the game and how it should be played, and instead have started to think about how the game can be played. And this conversation has been going on for a long, long time. You have people, and I mention this often, you have people who play role-playing games almost strictly as a board game, and there is a narrative umbrella that sort of contains the overall campaign, but the story itself doesn't matter so much, except that it is a reason for having one combat in this location, another combat in this location, the reason for tracking down this person. But the focus of the game is we travel from one dungeon to another dungeon, we do all the dungeon stuff, we then leave that dungeon, that plot line is completed, we go to someplace else, we do another dungeon, find out some stuff, that might take us to another one, and that's all it is. It's just dungeon after dungeon or adventure after adventure, and it wasn't really for quite a while after D&D existed that people started realizing, like, oh, we don't necessarily have to have that be the main focus of things. And let's keep going here, but that's sort of what I'm talking about in this instance. So a good example of an unintended consequence for me, and this is one that I really actually hate talking about because I really think Dungeon Crawl Classics is cool. And Dungeon Crawl Classics is another D&D-like role-playing game from Goodman Games. It's actually just a super fun, cool, very old school feeling game that if you never got to play AD&D or early generations of D&D, editions of D&D, Dungeon Crawl Classics is great. They use a lot of the same old artists. There's a lot of cool, very evocative black and white art. It has like all sorts of cool rules. It uses all the different dice. It's that's a little gimmicky, but that's fine. And when I say all the different dice, I mean like D5s, D7s, D14s, D16s. They have a whole special set of dice that you can buy to play specifically with DCC. And the specific thing I want to talk about with DCC is what they call their funnel. And the idea with this is you start off with a handful of characters. Let's just say 3 characters for each player. And they're all 0 level townsfolk, basically. Your stats are not great. I think it's a straight 3d6 roll, and you hope to get something good on all of your characters, but maybe not so much. But the thing that I don't like about the funnel, and the thing that I think this is an unintended consequence that I don't think they really wanted to have or encourage, which I guess would make it unintended, is if you have those 3 characters, those 3 0-level schlubs, and you know one of them from looking at its stats and its background and what it's capable of doing, you know one of them is the one you want to have as your player character. At least I've found that. There's always one. Maybe there's 2. Maybe you even got lucky and there are 3 good options. But assuming there's 1 or 2, it's going to change the way you play this funnel. And because you're 0 level, everybody has just 1 to, I don't know, 6 hit points. It's not very many. And the idea is your whole group of townspeople, so say you have 4 players at the table, they have a dozen characters between them. The townspeople find out about some weird thing that's going on and they go to investigate, or they're drawn into it, or a temple pops up outside of town and they say, we gotta figure out what's going on here. So it's something like that, right? So all these people go to this place to check it out, and whoever survives will then level up to first level, and you get to pick. So if you had multiple characters that lived through this funnel adventure, you could pick between the ones that you have left of your player characters to then become your PC in the game. And the idea behind it is really, really neat, because it sort of turns the average people of town into the heroes for the campaign and starts them out really in kind of an interesting origin story that makes sense in a role-playing game, and it makes sense in any sort of story, right? And the problem is, if I have one good character, I'm going to put that character toward the middle of the pack of all these other characters to increase the chances of that good character's survival. Because that's who I want to play. I want to play somebody competent and good. But what that means is the best character that I have, I want to keep safe. So I'm not going to expose it to danger. And I don't think that's what they intended. And I don't think that's how you should play the game. But anybody who is playing a game also understands that it's a game. And if I want to optimize things, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to stay near the middle, and maybe if the whole party gets hit by a fireball or a big trap or something, then that's not a safe place to be. But if you're being attacked by a bunch of skeletons, then yeah, if you're not in the middle of the fight, then you're not going to get killed like everybody else on the front lines, or like your other player characters that you have in the funnel who can effectively coordinate to defend the character that you want to play once the funnel adventure is over. And like I said, I think the funnel is really, really cool, but the unintended consequence of playing in a funnel is the character who will eventually go on to be the hero, or at least that's the theory, right? is not heroic at all in the first game. Maybe they get a chance later on in the first game after a bunch of other of the townsfolk have been killed off and they have to step up and do something. But that's not really heroic. That's like, oh, okay, I'm just gonna sit back here. Okay, now my two defenders died and maybe a couple other people, and now I'll step up and do something. And maybe they've acquired some type of weapons or magic item or something by that point to actually make them survive and get to first level, and then you start playing the game. So I think the funnel is a really good example of a great idea with a really bad unintended consequence. And it does change the way you play the game. Another big one in gaming that can have some unintended consequences, and this is very different than design-wise. This is at the table playing the game with friends or strangers, is stealing from player characters, stealing from the other player characters. The only time this is okay is if you have made it clear, and you should state out loud to everyone, my character is a rogue and is a bit of a klepto, or for whatever reason, maybe like in Critical Role, they just have a good time stealing stuff back and forth from each other, and it's fine because they are all in on it. They have all agreed to it. If you have people at your table who say, no, do not take anything from me, don't do it, because it will just cause chaos. It will, and sort of the unintended consequence of playing your character is you will break trust with that other character, and that's a bad thing, which is also the next thing on the list, is breaking trust. So I'm not saying that it's right for the other players at the table to tell you, no, you can't steal from me in a game, that it's all made up and it doesn't really matter, and you're likely not going to be taking anything significant like an artifact or their magic weapon. You would take coins or an earring or a ring or a necklace or their piton hammer or something like that. None of that stuff really matters, and if it does matter, the other player can just say, hey, listen, I know you took this, give it back to me. And it can lead to some fun role-playing stuff. In Critical Role, when Not the Brave in the second campaign comes around and she steals buttons. That whole thing is just such a great idea, and so Sam does that throughout the game, and steals sometimes from the PCs in ways that are kind of interesting. And there was also the thing where they stole the flask from Not, and there's some interesting stuff. So there can be really neat stuff that comes out of stealing from each other, and it could be like set up a cool rivalry, but everybody has to be okay with that, and you don't want to, as I said, break trust with somebody else at the table, because that will then lead to them not trusting you, not only not trusting that character, but not trusting you as a player and a person at the table, that you can be trusted to do the right thing and to not introduce chaos and not go against what everybody else at the table has agreed on in that social contract of, let's not steal from each other, we all agreed to that, and then you stole something from one of us and I specifically told you not to, now I just don't trust you. That's a really bad thing to have at a gaming table. It's a bad thing to have anywhere, right? To have somebody break your trust, and then you just can't trust in the fact that they're going to do what they tell you to do. So just be careful when you're doing things like that, and make sure you do have buy-in, and make sure in some cases the social contract around the gaming table is very unspoken. But I think this is one of those things that should be talked about, because it does have consequences both in-game and out of game. So keep that in mind. And I'm not going to touch on any of the other stuff that could be happening, above the table, in terms of like you and a friend are having a fight, you start dating one of the other people at the gaming table, and that has an effect on the dynamic between everybody. All of that stuff you also need to navigate as well. This I'm specifically tying into stealing from other player characters, and then using that as a bridge to talk about trust and the social contract, and just be careful with that, because things you do in the game and outside the game can have an effect in both of those arenas, and you just need to be careful about it. Power gaming is another unintended consequence, and this is a weird one, because some people would say if it's in the rules, then it's legal. Yep, I agree. It is legal. However, nobody is perfect, and when you have game systems like we do, there are going to be sections of it that are not developed to such an extent, or not designed and developed to such an extent, that they will be perfectly balanced, no matter what you do. Power gaming is one of those things that I think is... I understand it, because everybody wants their characters to be effective. They want to feel powerful and heroic, and like they're the coolest, best, most awesomest person in the game, or character in the game. But there's no point to power gaming. And the unintended consequence for power gaming as a player, so if I come to the table and I am an unapologetic power gamer, I'm not really, but if I am, I come to the table with my uber powerful, I don't even know, bard, which seems like a funny thing to say, but they are probably the best spellcaster in the game. But if I come to the table and I'm just gonna power game it, what I'm doing is upping the difficulty level for the campaign in general, and making myself so much more powerful than the rest of the PCs means it's going to be more challenging and more difficult for them, and potentially a lot less fun for them, and it's going to be more challenging and more difficult for the GM or DM to present challenges to the parties, to the party, that will challenge you and not kill everybody else at the table. The GM can always beat you if you're power gaming. The GM can always beat you no matter what. So if you just can't resist power gaming, try to keep it a little bit under control, if not for yourself, for everyone else at the table. And if you want to have something on your character that you can hold in reserve, so that, okay, if things go crazy, I want to be able to do something to get out of it, because I just hate losing. And I define losing as falling down in a fight, or failing to beat up whoever I'm facing in a fight, or not succeeding, no matter what it is. Then hold something back. Keep something in your back pocket where you design your character to be pretty normal, and then you know you have something to, as a fail-safe, I guess is what I would say. But even that can also unbalance things, because then your GM is going to know you have that and might have to have some way to solve for that in the game, so that it's not just always you just bulldoze over everything and there's no challenge in the game for you, and everybody else at the table isn't having fun. So that's the unintended consequence of power gaming. And just be aware of it, because the more you power game, the more the GM is going to throw at you and your party, and you will be frustrated because you have designed your character to be as powerful as possible within the rules, and yet it doesn't make a difference. So then why do it? Don't do it. Don't bother. You will lose. And that said, it is fun sometimes to be able to have these cool power gaming things, but it's more fun when you discover that stuff during play instead of planning for it specifically, and sort of really diluting the cohesion of your party and your group of players. I'm not a big fan of power gaming because I just don't see the point. Another unintended consequence, and this is a huge one. This really is one of the reasons I'm talking about this. In AD&D and early editions of D&D, so the box set and all that sort of stuff, one of the things you got experience, well, the two things you got experience for most of all was coins, so treasure, and or the gold piece value of whatever you happen to recover. So it could be like a golden coffer, or it could be a set of decorated chainmail with gems on it that's worth 2,000 gold or something like that. That was worth experience, and so and killing creatures was worth experience. That's what you got. It wasn't until really much later that they said, okay, you don't have to kill the creature to defeat it. You just have to outsmart it, somehow get past it in a way that you are outthinking it, or beating it in some way. So you could, in fact, talk your way out of encounters and still earn experience for that because you did it in a way that negated the effect of the encounter. I mean, there still was an encounter, but you survived it and are able to move on. This has changed, obviously, over the years, but the unintended consequence of getting experience for two things, coins and killing, was the whole advent of this murder hobo idea. And it's still such a huge part of D&D, and the idea that, and really it made it a board game, right? So you were going to a place to achieve something, get some treasure, kill some monsters, to get more powerful, and that's what everybody did. And so there wasn't really, other than to just entertain yourselves, there wasn't a huge reason to do the role-playing side of it, of talking to each other in character, talking to NPCs in character, and that's why you run into a lot of people who, whether they're new or old gamers, it doesn't matter, it's just a matter of style, will say, my character says blah 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 blah. Or even use their character's name, Truck says blah 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 blah. And instead of just saying it themselves in character, and that's because it didn't matter if you spoke in character. That wasn't what the game was about. The game was about killing things and taking their stuff. Murder hobos. And I don't care for that term, but it is unfortunately really appropriate. Now we've moved quite a ways away from that, which I think is great. And this change happened, obviously, over decades and decades and decades, because people have been running games that are very role-playing centric for a long time, but the rules are only really just now, especially for D&D, catching up to that with things like bonds and flaws and the other things that they have, the ideals and personality, that you can assign something to your character to give the other players and yourself some narrative hooks to do things in the game outside of combat. And due to this change, we've seen the rise in popularity of shows like, any streaming D&D game, right? Hopefully you're not just sitting there watching people move guys around on the board and kill people. It is much more about, and one of the reasons why Critical Role and some of the other streams are so engaging is because the characters are interesting, and because they are doing things that might be suboptimal and might not be the best decision for the character or for the group or for that specific situation, and that makes it more of a story and more relatable, and also introduces that whole like, oh no, you should have done this, and so you can kind of second guess and all that sort of stuff, and it makes it much more interesting. Definitely games like stuff from White Wolf, Vampire, Wraith, Changeling, that sort of thing, were a huge step in the direction away from experience for coins and killing, because that's not what you got experience at all for in those games. But now we're seeing it be worked into D&D, and we're even seeing it with things like the adventure paths from Paizo, and any company that produces something like that, plot points from Pinnacle or Peg Inc., the guys who make Deadlands and Savage Worlds. But there's all sorts of games that do this, right? Like almost all of them now have started to move more towards this narrative play acting thing. And in fact, I was going to mention this particular adventure, Wild Beyond the Witchlight, is it's so cool. You can run through this adventure without having combat if you want. And I think that is amazing. And I know there are people who will hate this adventure for specifically that reason. Why has it got to be peaceful and blah blah blah? Because you don't have to fight. Yeah, I mean, you don't do that in the real world when somebody like charges you the wrong amount for your car repair, right? You don't pull out your knife and gut them. That's just not how we handle conflict in the real world. So why is it acceptable in D&D other than like, oh, we're in medieval times and that's what people did? No, they didn't really. I mean, there was more violence and more weapons around, and then that's arguable. But it was not all that common. That's why there were always laws against killing people and raping people and stealing things and robbing things. And so it's interesting to see this change and how it's happened over time. And I love that the Wild Beyond the Witchlight can be played as a pure role-playing game, and you could do the entire adventure that way, and it's amazing that they're doing that. But again, the unintended consequence was murder hobos, and now we're sort of course correcting on that. And I shouldn't even say course correcting. We're changing and introducing new and different styles of play so that the game appeals to an even wider audience, which I think is fantastic and amazing. And if you wanted to play a character who is not violent, then this is a great adventure for that. And they've taken the thinking of how to... They've taken the difficulty of how to design encounters that can be resolved without combat out of your hands, because that can be challenging to come up with, and instead put it into this adventure in certain ways, and then you can just be prepared for that. I think it's fantastic. And if you are new to gaming and you are looking to try out a new and different type of game that you think might be interesting, I definitely recommend Wild Beyond the Witchlight. There is some great stuff in there. So that's everything in terms of unintended consequences, and I hope that gives you an idea of the sorts of things I'm talking about. And I hope it also makes you think about what you are doing when you design your characters. How is it that I want to play this character? What does making this decision mean for me later when I'm actually playing the character, and how they interact with the world? If I take, again, talking about D&D or Pathfinder, if I take like the athlete feat, that's going to mean my character is going to want to do more athletic stuff because they're actually talented at it and they're good at it. If I take the Dungeon Delver feat, and I'm a rogue, I'm going to be the one who's out front looking for all the traps, setting off traps, hopefully keeping safe from them because the advantage is because of it. And I just become that much more of a rogue because I have specialized in that one specific thing. Now, if I didn't take that, and instead of taking Dungeon Delver, I took... what would be another good feat for a rogue? I can't even think of anything off the top of my head. I have to look at a player's handbook. What would be a good feat for a rogue? I keep thinking of a spellcaster, and that's no good. But you could even have a rogue who has... I'm getting there. Hold on. Getting to the feats. I should have had this open. I didn't even think of this. Yeah, here we go. So, if I'm a or if I'm a rogue, or I could take crossbow expert, If I'm a crossbow expert as a bow or as a rogue, I am going to want to stay hidden at range and snipe at people. I do not want to be out front, and at least not necessarily out front and looking for traps. My safe place is back there shooting at whoever you're in combat with because I can target them and deal extra damage and not expose myself to danger in any way at all. That's how I want to play my character. Or I could take dual wielder, in which case I will want to be up in combat and stabbing people. All of these things have consequences on how you play your character and how you interact with the world, and that's really what I'm talking about here. So for Thaco Thursday, we are going to take a look at, oh, this is fun, the original AD&D Monster Manual. If you don't have a copy of this, I'm sure you can probably find a PDF online. I don't know where I found this one. It was just on my computer. And I don't know if somebody gave it to me or what. It's a mystery. But this is the original Monster Manual, and man, look at how far the art has come. Obviously, for players who have played D&D for a long time, you are familiar with this book. You may have checked it out in a store at some point. You may have seen a PDF of it before. You may have seen it at a friend's house or the father of a friend's house, or the house of the friend's father, whatever I'm trying to say. Not that the house is the father. But it's really fun to look at this old stuff because it is so different than the modern stuff in ways that are unexpected. Even looking through this stuff in terms of, like I said, the art, the fact that it's black and white in the interior, and that was true really up until White Wolf in the late 80s, early 90s. It had to be the early 90s when they started doing their books in color, and everybody was like, holy cow, this is amazing. And I'm sure there were color books before that, but they really made a splash, and that changed almost the entire industry over to color instead of black and white. There's a foreword here. Oh, I'm sure it's very painful to read. Why don't we try to read this? This will be our Thaco Thursday for today. Foreword. It is with a certain measure of pride that we at TSR bring you the second part of the new Dungeons & Dragons releases. Second part. So this was the second book after the... I hope the Player's Handbook is actually what came out. I assume so. The long-awaited Monster Manual for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or Advanced D&D. We are doubly proud of the format of this book, i.e., that is, or i.e. is, e.g. is... For example, i.e. is that is. It's special hardcover. Oh my goodness. A first in the gaming world and another step in our continuing quest for top quality products. A hardcover book was a first, and this was 1977. Wow. As time goes on, the AD&D phenomenon shows no sign of subsiding. Indeed. Indeed, the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons continues to grow and grow. This trend is very gratifying to us at TSR and encourages us to devote even more time and attention to the D&D. Witness the series of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, I guess they must mean the TV show, and related materials, playing aids, accessories. Our aim is to provide a top-quality family of products for use with Dungeons & Dragons game system, items that we hope you will find useful, innovative, and enjoyable. I did, thank you. With the outstanding growth of Dungeons & Dragons has come the growth of TSR hobbies, since it is no secret that the fantastic response to D&D has allowed TSR to expand and explore many new directions in the gaming hobby. Therefore, we owe our thanks to you, the many devoted gamers who have supported TSR through your enthusiasm and encouragement, and finally your purchases. Our livelihood depends upon your continued support, and we intend to keep earning it by continuing to bring you innovative products in the future. We appreciate the widespread audience that our games, and especially D&D, have achieved, and we look forward to increasing the exposure of our games and rules. Without such an enthusiastic and loyal following, this would not be possible, so we thank you. The success of Dungeons & Dragons, again, this is like late 70s, early 80s they're talking about this, so the game has been around since 74, so this is within the first decade. This is probably written within the first 5 years of the game's existence. The success of Dungeons & Dragons has spawned a considerable number of imitations and spin-off products, Really, they just ended up creating an entirely new genre, much like Magic the Gathering did with collectible card games, even if collectible games and cards were around previously. Um, Perhaps inevitably they would create these imitations. Some of these have merit, many, however, do not. Oh, that's quite judgy. And although we may concede their right to exist, that's mighty nice of you to concede their right to exist. Yet you have nothing to do with their right to exist. However dependent they may be on D&D's audience, yeah, okay, they're a little full of themselves. We would caution the perspective, but again, even that sentence, right? They are assuming D&D is its own unique thing, and it's not. It's a new art form. It's a new way to play a game and to interact with your friends and to sit down at a table and do things together. Oh, that's so funny. We would encourage caution. We would caution the prospective buyer to consider their true value and not be confused with those items which bear the Dungeons and Dragons or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons name and constitute the official D&D family of products. Oh, what a bunch of pompousness. As for value, let the others be measured against the standard of quality we have striven for, a hardbound encyclopedia of monsters, for instance, as opposed to a low-quality collection which is poorly assembled and bound, which is exactly what the previous editions of D&D were. So that's nice that you can afford to publish hardcover books. It's a new genre of things, so get over yourself. This present work, as will be apparent from the sheer bulk alone, which is also funny because the book is so not thick compared to the books we see now, is the result of a considerable amount of work and preparation by many persons. All of this has been undertaken with the eye towards providing a final result which can be regarded as the definitive collection of monsters for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Definitive, right, because we haven't had hundreds and hundreds more since this book came out. An encyclopedic collection of information certain to be of invaluable use to players and dungeon masters alike, complete with game specifications, background details, and in many cases with an illustration in addition. Exclamation point. Yes, because who wouldn't want art with their monster book? Again, completely new type of book. So art was like something that I'm sure they said, well, we probably need to show people what these things look like, because in a novel, you don't get a lot of illustrations typically. This is not a novel. This is more like a catalog of options for people to use in their games. And so art became very important, and it's only increased in importance. In fact, it was equally important back then. They just didn't have the money or the resources to be able to hire artists like they do now. Of course, no work can be truly definitive for as long as players possess an active imagination. Many new and fascinating monsters will continue to arise, and this is only as it should be. One final note, as valuable as this volume is with its wealth of information, some DMs may wisely wish to forbid their players from referring to the manual in the midst of an encounter, since it will be considerably more challenging to confront a monster without an instant rundown of its strengths and weaknesses, and besides, a D&D player's true mettle and knowledge will be put to the test. As even the most casual D&D player knows, that's what this fascinating game is all about. Read on and enjoy. Mike Carr, September 27th, 1977, just like I said. I don't actually know who Mike Carr is, and that kind of sucks, because I was certainly around in these days and was a fan of D&D only a handful of years later and have been playing for 40 years now. This is really interesting because you'll see, even in this introduction, that last paragraph, they say some GMs may want to forbid their players from looking at the monster manual, because that social contract hadn't existed yet of either, if you don't know what a monster is, don't look it up, or if you're not running the game, don't buy or use or look through the monster manual, or if you already know, then you know. And like for me, playing D&D, if you describe a monster, I pretty much am going to know what it is. I'm probably going to know what its weaknesses are, if any, if it has any vulnerabilities, that sort of thing. Or immunities, resistances. And it does become more challenging the more people know about a game. and the more people know about the monsters that they'll be facing, which is also why people make new monster books all the time, which is why I wrote a monster book and will be kickstarting it at some point here. But yeah, really interesting to read through this stuff and see like how the thinking was being done. That's it. That's Thaco Thursday for today. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll be back on Tuesday with something new. I think it's going to be talking about, like I said, Mordenkainen presents Monsters of the Multiverse. So if you would like another overview of this book before it comes out, and you have to decide whether or not you absolutely want to spend money on it, or if you want to pre-order it before the price goes back up when the book is released, if that happens, we'll do that next week. Thanks very much, and I hope you like this one. Please like, subscribe, and share. Again, almost at 60 followers. Thank you for the new followers. I appreciate it, and we'll see you soon. Stand by for adventure.